Yesterday I was watching the Turkish coverage of the attack in the German Christmas market, and there was a very vigorous discussion about the nature of terrorism and the way one terrorist group infects another terrorist group and so on. But the person who was driving the car in the Christmas market appears to have been a Saudi doctor resident in the town who had been taken into Germany as a refugee, who had himself questioned Islam and therefore had found it was dangerous to live in Saudi Arabia. So this person doesn't fit the template of an ISIS or a Daesh terrorist, despite the conversation that was going on in the Turkish studio last night. And while I think it's perfectly reasonable to point out that the terrorist activities of Daesh are interlinked with the terrorist activities of PKK and of other groups, I think it's also possible and important to recognize that people who have advocated terror in the past can renounce that and embrace the ballot box. Ahmed al-Sharaa, formerly known as Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, leads Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, this prominent Syrian rebel group. An HTS which originated from the al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate. Al-Sharaa has now announced a severance of ties with al-Qaeda, rebranding the group as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, and this later evolved into HTS, and that in turn is now a is now under his leadership a non-violent organization. It's tried to distance itself from extremist ideologies, emphasizing a focus on Syria's national interests rather than a global jihad. And this shift aims to gain broader domestic and international legitimacy. And in recent statements, al-Sharaa has pledged to protect minority groups and promote tolerance within Syria, which would be a great contrast to Assad's reign. He's also expressed intentions to establish an inclusive government and called for the lifting of international sanctions imposed during the reign of Assad. But despite these declarations, skepticism remains regarding the sincerity of HTS's transformation, and the group continues to be designated as a terrorist organization by several countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom. And international observers advocate for a cautious approach, emphasizing the need to assess HTS's actions over time to determine the authenticity of its commitment to renouncing terrorism and embracing an inclusive governance. But in the meantime, I think we should act proleptically. We should anticipate the reality of a complete turnaround, a metanoia. And in the same way as we recognized and accepted the turnaround, for example, of Menachem Begin and Nelson Mandela, both leaders who transitioned from involvement in violent resistance to being internationally recognized statesmen, shaping the trajectories of their respective nations. Both had backgrounds involving militant strategies labeled as terrorism by their opponents, but eventually renounced these methods in favor of negotiation and peace. Mandela co-founded the ANC's armed wing in 1961 in response to the apartheid regime's brutal suppression of peaceful protests, notably the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. Mandela initially advocated non-violence, but became convinced that peaceful means alone could not dismantle apartheid. And MK focused on sabotage rather than direct attacks on civilians. It targeted infrastructure such as power plants, government buildings, military installations to disrupt the apartheid state, while minimizing a loss of life. And Mandela underwent military training abroad, studying guerrilla tactics in Algeria and Ethiopia. He played a part in a pivotal role in planning Operation Maibuyim, a blueprint for a broader guerrilla campaign, even if it was never actually implemented. And he was arrested in 1962 and later convicted in the Rivonia trial in 1964 and sentenced to life imprisonment. And during his 27-year imprisonment, his views evolved, and by the 1980s, he was advocating for negotiation as a primary means to achieve change. In 1985, he said, "Let bygones be bygones, let what has happened pass, we must work together to build South Africa." And by 1990, upon his release, Mandela had renounced violence, emphasizing reconciliation and dialogue with the apartheid regime. Similarly, Menachem Begin, who was the leader of the Irgun, a paramilitary Zionist organization active during the British Mandate in Palestine, it was classified as a terrorist group by the British for its use of violence to achieve the Jewish statehood. And the big events were the King David Hotel bombing in 1946 under Begin's leadership, and it killed 91 people, including civilians, and Begin claimed the British were warned, but the attack remains highly controversial even today. The Deir Yassin massacre in 1948, the Irgun, alongside the Lehi, attacked the Arab village of Deir Yassin, killing over 100 people, including women and children, and this was intended to intimidate Arabs into fleeing, facilitating Jewish-Israeli territorial gains. Begin justified these actions as necessary for Jewish survival and statehood in a hostile environment. But of course, what he was doing was laying the groundwork to the present crisis. He transitioned to political leadership, founding the right-wing Herut Party, which later became Likud. And as Prime Minister from 1977 to 1983, he pursued a peace campaign, signing the Camp David Accords with Egypt's Anwar Sadat in 1978, returning the Sinai Peninsula in exchange for peace, a remarkable shift from his militant roots, even if his militancy has an echo in the Gaza crises of today. Both Mandela and Begin engaged in militant activities aiming at ending perceived oppression, apartheid for Mandela, British colonial rule for Begin, and their respective movements were labelled as terrorist organisations by their opponents. And that's not to underestimate the terror that they were involved in. Mandela renounced violence as part of his broader vision for democratic and an inclusive South Africa, and Begin shifted to democracy, culminating in the peace treaty with Egypt, an unprecedented act in the Arab-Israeli conflict. But what is important is the fact that whether you recalibrate the definition of terrorism in the first place for Begin and Mandela, and I don't think one should, it is possible to see a transformation. It is possible for a transformation from violence to non-violence to occur and to be genuine. And I think we should promote that and celebrate that and encourage that. Both these two leaders, Mandela and Begin, were awarded Nobel Prizes in their own right. Mandela in 1993, Begin in 1978. There are differences between them. Mandela's MK primarily targeted infrastructure, while Begin's Irgun was directed at both military and civilian institutions. Mandela's shift was framed as a moral and pragmatic evolution, whereas Begin maintained that his earlier actions were justified but recognised the necessity of peace. I don't think it really matters. What matters is to recognise the reality of the terror and the reality of the new peace. Both men demonstrate the complex interplay between violent resistance and the eventual pursuit of peace. In the end, peace is the only option. showcasing how individuals once labelled as terrorists can emerge as architects of reconciliation. People can change, and I hope that even in being perhaps sceptical, the world community is supportive of Ahmed al-Sharaa and the new Syria, because it's important to encourage hope where hope even modestly exists.